I'd also like to thank the Schenectady County Human Rights Commission for inviting me to speak today, the Schenectady County legislators, and the Schenectady County Community College for sponsoring this program. I would also like to thank Arthur Butler, the Executive Director of the Schenectady County Human Rights Commission. The subject I'm talking about today, and with your theme, Civil Rights Then and Now, is something very close to my heart. And it's the subject of my book, Lighting the Fires of Freedom. During the Civil Rights Movement, African Americans led the fight to free this country from the vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow. African American women played significant roles at all levels of the civil rights movement, yet too often they were invisible and they have remained invisible to the larger public. While some African American women led causes and organizations, others did not have titles or official roles. They did not stand on ceremony. They simply did the work that needed to be done without expectation of personal gain. Often unnamed and underappreciated, African American women helped to construct the cultural architecture for change. Women, such as the crusading anti-lynching journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett and Rosa Parks, were also anti-rape activists. They tried to protect Black women from the white Southern tradition of droit de seigneur, literally the right of the Lord. In the antebellum and Jim Crow South, that meant Black women's lives and bodies did not matter. Black women were abused and raped at will and without punishment. African American women leaders and activists addressed the most important and volatile issues of the times: segregation, lynching, education, economic justice. People who lived and worked in the heat of the civil rights cauldron were the heart and soul of the movement, their heroic actions, often putting themselves and their families in harm's way, were without equal. As servant leaders, African American women were rooted in their desire first to serve their communities rather than gaining power for themselves. But they were not servile. I came to my activism, honestly, through my mother, Willie Mae Neal, who was born in rural Arkansas. She and her family lived 100 miles from Little Rock, Arkansas, which was the nearest high school for Black children. So my mother's formal education stopped at 8th grade. As the youngest of 3 daughters, she had to remain home to help her parents take care of their 35 acres. They did not have 40 acres and a mule. My grandparents were absolutely amazing. My grandmother, Sophronia McKnight, was 4'11" or 4'8". We still argue about how tall she really was. But she didn't take any stuff from anybody. In those days, on Fridays, the insurance people would come around and they would collect the premiums. They were all white young men. And one time a young man came and he did not get the memo. You do not mess with Sophronia McKnight's daughters. So he fondled one of her daughters in front of her. So my grandmother, all 4'8" or 11, walks over to the gun rack. Because in those days you had to keep guns out. You never knew what you were going to be facing. So she took the gun from the rack and she pointed it so that she shot, so that she missed the young man's ear intentionally by just about an inch. This is the family lore. Well, he was not totally stupid, so he left. And when he left, my grandparents sent their daughters away because they thought surely they were going to be lynched. but they refused to leave. They refused to take low to anyone. They stood their ground. So 1 week went by, 2 weeks went by, and nothing happened to their surprise. A few weeks later, another young white insurance man shows up and he looks at my grandmother, or looked down, since she was all of 4'8" or 4'11", and he said, "Aunt Sophronia," as if nothing had ever happened. That is the stock I come from, and those are the people I try to honor every day. I want to show you a poster from a Klan rally that I actually took off a telephone pole about 1967, 68, then the days when I was far more foolish than I am now. And so along with a group of interracial protesters and civil rights workers, we decided we would go to a Klan rally. And after a while, when we noticed that the Klan was noticing us and it was getting to be a little bit too dangerous, we decided to leave. And as we were leaving, I ripped this poster off the telephone pole to remind me of the encounter. The Klan would come through the Black community, particularly the rural Black community, the cowards with their hoods on, just to strike fear and into the hearts of people. And it's amazing to me how the people would survive with their full humanity intact. I mean, Black people, because it's a very frightening thing. And on the poster, if you see it, it says, it talks about Christianity, and it says the white public only. And as I've said in other speeches, that there were no Muslims in sight. This was white Christians who were trying to keep Black people, Black Christians for the most part, subjugated. That's the history in this country. Septima Clark lived in South Carolina, in the Sea Islands, and she started citizenship schools. And she lost her job because of that. Years later, decades later, after her pension had been terminated, her pension was finally restored. It took a long time for that. But again, like my grandmother, she did not back down to anyone. Ella Baker. People know that name more so than some of the other people. Ella Baker was an advisor to all of the major civil rights organizations, but she's most known for working with the young people of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. They called her Fundi. Fundi means someone who helps one generation move into the other generation. She was absolutely an amazing person. Fannie Lou Hamer, many people know of her. She's very famous for that statement, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Born in rural Mississippi, she absolutely showed courage. She was beaten when she tried to register to vote, but that did not stop her. She was one of the founders of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and she went to the Democratic National Convention in 1964. She was so powerful that LBJ called a fake press conference in the Rose Garden to take attention away from her, so that the television cameras would not broadcast her, but would broadcast him. Fannie Lou Hamer, a name we all should remember all the time. I'd like to mention the women of the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott lasted over a year. Over a year, when people walked. You can barely get people to walk across the street, but folks walked for over a year to protest the segregation in public transportation. They did not take the bus. And how did that come about? There was a lot of vision and planning. And so that to me represents a microcosm of women's leadership and creative problem solving. You had Joanne Robinson, who was a professor at the local Black college, who had planned in advance alternate transportation systems just in case this event would happen. That event that started the bus boycott was when Rosa Parks sat down to stand up for justice. But how did people know what to do? They had to mimeograph. This, of course, was pre-internet and everything. So overnight, after Mrs. Parks did her courageous act, they printed leaflets and they sent them to the Black community, hoping that people would get them and not ride the buses the next day. And they waited, and to their astonishment, people honored the boycott that lasted for over a year. Now, Claudette Colvin actually had sat down on the bus a few months before Mrs. Parks, but she was a teenager and she was not considered the proper symbol for the boycott. And so her protest did not get the same kind of traction as that of Mrs. Parks, whom was widely loved by everyone. She was the secretary of the local NAACP, among other things. Now, secretary did not mean you were taking dictation. Secretary meant that you were investigating things like rape, lynchings, you were planning protests, you were really involved in what the movement was about. Georgia Gilmore, a cook, what she did was she formed a club from nowhere. And what that was is that she and other cooks, household workers, low wage, no wage workers decided that their way of supporting the movement was to raise money in the best way they could, bake goods and what have you. And they called it the Club from Nowhere to try to give themselves some anonymity, but everybody knew who they were. And of course, Rosa Parks. Daisy Bates of Little Rock, Arkansas, again, head of the local NAACP. She was the advisor for a group of young people called the Little Rock Nine, who integrated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was very violent reaction to their peaceful integration. They actually had to call the National Guard to escort the students into that school. One student who did not get the word that they had changed the entrance to walk through that crowd by herself. So she was separated from the others. So there are 8, and then there's one student, and there's pictures of her walking through, being spat upon and yelled at by white people, adults, mostly adults, as well as children. It was a trauma that stayed with her for the rest of her life. And the people who are the pioneers, who really suffered a lot, but they gave all of their heart and soul to what the movement was about. Speaking of giving a lot, Mamie Till Mobley, whose son Emmett Till was killed. They lived in Chicago, and she sent her son, then a teenager, down to Mississippi to spend the summer with his relatives. And it said that he either said, "Hey, baby," whistle that, or something to a white woman. Later, we all knew, of course, that that was false. But this woman told her husband, who then told some other white men. And later there was a knock on the door that night. They came, they dragged this child out of his relative's home, and they mutilated him and threw his body in the river. Mrs. Mobley, who had no hatred for anyone, but she did something that was, we call that adaptive leadership. She decided that her son's murder would not go unnoticed. And so she had an open casket funeral. I will spare you that picture. There is a picture you see of Mrs. Mobley and her sweet son, Emmett. And that murder was something that shocked the nation into seeing what it really was happening to Black people in the Deep South. But she wanted the nation to confront the brutality and to feel the pain. Now, when I was writing a story for The Nation magazine, I put in there that Mrs. Mobley said that she could love the children of those people who killed her son as much as she could love her son or anyone else. And I was fact checked because they said, no one's that good. No, that was not true. So they fact checked me. And of course, I was right. And so most of us are not that good, but Emmett Till's mother was. Constance Baker Motley was the first woman to join the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She was another courageous person who went down south, and she would argue these cases in segregated courthouses where people were, the lawyers even were mistreated. But she was such a um, figure. People would come, first of all, she was the only woman, and she was Black. People would come from miles around to watch her argue cases in these Southern courts. They called her that motley woman. She, you see her there with two people I'm sure you recognize, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Later, Constance Baker Motley became the first woman, first Black to be the Manhattan borough president, and she was then appointed a federal district judge. She represents the the brave lawyers, the committed lawyers, those who work very hard to move the arc of justice. So now I'm going to do a quick survey of the 9 women I interviewed in the book. I like to give a little bit more background as you've just heard, so you get a real sense of those times. The first one is Leah Chase. She died recently, but she was absolutely amazing. She was a chef. The family restaurant, Dookie Chase in New Orleans, Louisiana, was a gathering place for civil rights workers, from the young people of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to Martin Luther King to the lawyers from the North who came there, and of course the lawyers from the South. Remember those times, even though New Orleans has this genteel reputation, it was still the heart of the Deep South, and they could have been shut down at any time, but they were not, because of the respect that the Chase family had in that community. And as with the other women that you'll see, there will be a picture of her during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and a more recent picture. Mrs. Chase is also the inspiration for the Princess Tiana in The Princess and the Frog. June Jackson Christmas was a Northerner. She was born and raised in Massachusetts. But what she did was she and her husband, at a point when they moved to New York City, hosted civil rights workers and at their home and gave them an opportunity for vacations and for treatment. June Jackson Christmas was one of the first Black people to graduate from Vassar College. She also graduated from Boston University College of Medicine and Psychiatry. She felt that people needed to talk about what we now know as post-traumatic stress, but then people didn't really have a word for that. The first picture you see of Dr. June Jackson Christmas is her speaking at an American Psychiatric Association event the day after students were killed at Jackson State College in 1970. It's also amazing that when she was a student at Vassar, she championed the rights of Japanese Americans during World War II. Japanese Americans had their property taken from them, and they were put in really in concentration camps. She and her group of friends, all of whom were white, went to the head of the college and they said, well, we would like to have college offer scholarships for these young people who are our age in California, particularly. The head of the college said, oh, no, we can't do that because that would be discriminatory. That would be racist. Not understanding that when you only have a couple of Blacks in each class in your college, that was probably racist and discriminatory. But that did not deter then June Jackson. So she and her friends went back to the dorm and they said, aha. So they came up with an idea and they went back to the head of the college and they said, what if we offer scholarships to people who were displaced by the war, not specifically to Japanese Americans? And the head of the college said, okay, I can do that. But of course, the only people who were displaced were Japanese Americans. The German Americans were not similarly displaced. Later on, Dr. Christmas specialized in community mental health care, especially for low-income African Americans, and served as mental health commissioner under 3 New York City mayors. And she was very active in affordable housing issues, fighting discrimination in housing. Eileen Hernandez, who was active as a student at Howard University, which is getting a lot of play these days since that is the alma mater of our vice president-elect. But Eileen Hernandez attended Howard University in the 40s, which was totally discriminated because it was below the Mason-Dixon line. Eileen Hernandez went from New York to go to Howard University, and she talks about getting that part of the trip. Her father took her, the sleeping car porters. They said, when you get to Washington, D.C., look for the black taxi. So they get there and they're looking. They didn't see a black taxi, so they went to the first taxi they saw, and the white driver said, no, look for the black taxi. So they did this a couple times. Then they finally figured it out. The black taxi was the few taxis that would transport Black people from the train station to wherever they were going, in this case to Howard University. And so she was incensed at that kind of discrimination, became an absolute activist. Later on, she also became the first Black, and sadly, the only Black president of the National Organization for Women. She was active in the labor movement. She was also the first Black and the first woman to be a commissioner for the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Judy Richardson represents the young people of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. You see her at a lunch counter. I mean, something that simple. You have to protest to sit at a lunch counter or walk through hostile crowds. Judy was one of the people who ran the wide area telephone service, which really was a lifeline of such, because when people went out to do civil rights work, they were told to call in that evening so people would know that they were still alive. And that was a very important service. Judy is very modest and doesn't think she did a lot, as with many of the people who were involved in the civil rights movement at all levels. But of course, she did so much. Later on, she helped found one of the largest Black bookstores in the country. And she was the series associate producer for the landmark series, Eyes on the Prize. Diane Nash. Diane Nash was a student at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And she took over the Freedom Rides, when the original bus carrying Freedom Riders from the Congress on Racial Equality was firebombed. People just barely got out of that bus alive. And there was some talk in the movement, well, perhaps we shouldn't go further. And Diane Nash said, if we allow violence to stop us now, we will never go forward, and that freedom was worth our risk. So she took over the planning of the Freedom Rides. Later on, she went back home to Chicago and became a tenant activist. All of these women remained active their whole lives. They didn't stop. The civil rights movement was not something that was, it was obviously a seminal event in their lives and the lives of the country, but it was not the only event. These women lived whole, complete, active lives. Kathleen Cleaver. Kathleen Cleaver was the communications director, among other things, for the Black Panther Party. She and her late then husband were for a while on the FBI most wanted list, and they fled the country and they lived abroad where their children were born. At some point, she came back to this country. She's one of the smartest people you'll ever meet, and also one of the nicest. Remember, the Black Panther Party was really started to provide such things as free hot breakfast for children. It did not deserve that violent reputation, that reputation for violence that people put upon them. But Kathleen, when she came back, went to undergraduate school at Yale, where she graduated summa cum laude, and then she went to Yale Law School. She teaches now at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. When I told people I was interviewing Kathleen Cleaver, everyone said, is she still as gorgeous as she once was? Well, you can see that for yourself. Gay McDougall integrated Agnes Scott College outside of Atlanta, Georgia. She was the first Black, and for 2 years, she was the only Black student in that college. Can you imagine the isolation? After about 2 years, she said, I'm out of here. So she went to Bennington and she got her undergraduate degree. And she too then went to law school at Yale. She later became very active in the anti-apartheid movement, and she led many demonstrations in Washington, D.C. She also was an overseer at the first election for Free South Africa, when the great Nelson Mandela was elected president. And when he went to vote for the very first time, he asked Gay McDougall to accompany him. So you see her in that photo. She is now a professor at Fordham. She has been involved over the years with the United Nations for the Committee to End Racial Discrimination. Gloria Richardson led the movement in Cambridge, Maryland, and she got involved really to support her then teenage daughter. And Gloria Richardson, unlike Diane Nash, who's a real pacifist, Gloria Richardson was not a pacifist. She thought that nonviolence was a tactic, but that people had to defend themselves. And in fact, there's a lot of talk about how much people did or did not defend themselves in the rural South. I told you about my grandmother. What I didn't tell you is that often when you had these demonstrations, you had the deacons of defense in the rural South who had to protect Black people. If not, they would have been killed. But Gloria Richardson was considered middle class by Black standards, and she was asked by the local establishment not to be involved, and she persisted in her involvement, and in fact such that they cut off the support to her family business and what have you, but that did not deter her at all. 50 years later, she was given an award by the local area, and you can see her looking a little bit surprised that came about. After her involvement in the Cambridge movement, then there is Myrlie Evers. Picture you see is of Mrs. Evers at the gravesite of her husband, Medgar Evers, who was killed in their driveway in 1963, essentially in front of them. Visited their home, which is now a historic landmark. And there's not a front door, it's a side door because people knew the danger. And so you would get out, the car would normally drive to the garage, and that's where you get out. And this particular time, Medgar Evers forgot for a second. I guess he was elated from this rally, and he got out of the car in the driveway, not in the garage. And his killer was across the street and shot him. I don't mention his name. Everybody knew who did it. All the white people, all the black people. There were 2 hung juries, and finally, Medgar Evers' killer was brought to justice. Mrs. Evers and the children stayed in that house for over a year after Mr. Evers was assassinated. I'm going to end this presentation reading a little bit from the chapter of Myrlie Evers. Born in Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1933, Myrlie Beasley was raised by her aunt and grandmother. When she was 17 and a student at Alcorn A&M College in Lorman, Mississippi, she met her future husband, Medgar Evers. They married when she was 18. When Medgar Evers was appointed the first NAACP field secretary in the state of Mississippi in 1954, he negotiated a paid position for Myrlie as the office's secretary. They were basically the office. Their home was firebombed in 1962. In 1963, Medgar Evers was assassinated in their driveway. In the summer of 1964, she addressed the NAACP convention at the time when the civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, were missing and not yet discovered murdered. When she moved to California, she went back to college at the age of 31, working part-time, and she graduated from Pomona College in 1968 with a degree in sociology. She was the force behind the pursuit of justice for her husband. Mrs. Evers remains beautiful, gracious, grateful, and propelled by an invisible life force, a mixture of compassion, curiosity, and righteous anger. Her candor and openness can shock one expecting to encounter a martyr or a saint. She is defiantly a whole person. For African Americans, preserving personhood is itself an accomplishment. The following words are hers. I was very fortunate to be surrounded by people who loved me dearly. My grandmother and my aunt told me I could accomplish anything that I set my mind to do as long as I stayed within the boundaries of what society had set for me. Medgar came along and said, you can do whatever you want to do, but keep those boundaries out of the way. You never stop dreaming for something higher and better. Medgar was a veteran of World War II, as was my father. When Medgar returned to Mississippi, he decided to confront the rampant prejudice and racism. I came along and learned as we moved forward in the work. Medgar and I first moved to a town called Mound Bayou, formed by former slaves. Medgar was one of the first African Americans to apply for admission to the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss. He applied to the law school. He went to visit the head of the NAACP in Mississippi to talk about that group supporting him in a suit for admittance. Instead, they talked him into taking the position as the first field secretary for the NAACP and opening an office in Jackson. a very, very interesting time. It was not only typing, organizing events or celebrations, or even the sad things to acknowledge people who had been hurt, who had been killed. I did research for his speeches. I even wrote some of them. We were behind the cotton curtain because you cannot get information out to the wire services that you could in any other part of the country. It meant being concise with what you reported and sending that information to the NAACP office in New York City, and you did it by telegram. I was a welcoming committee to people who came in. Everyone visited our home. Our house was so small, but we always found a place. I think of Thurgood Marshall, Constance Baker Motley, attorney Dewart Bell. What a terrible time I had trying to balance a budget of $25 every 2 weeks, feeding and housing people. It was an exciting but frightening time because you stared at death every day and you walked, and death walked along with you. But there was always hope, and there were always people who surrounded you to give you a sense of purpose. You tried to prepare. You do a little role playing. I personally would put myself in a position mentally where I had just lost my husband. I knew it was coming. I recall a conversation with Medgar not too long before his assassination. I said to him, I can't live without you. I can't make it without you. And he looked at me and said, you're much stronger than you think you are. You will be okay. You must believe it. Today, when I visit my former home, I can still see the blood. We needed to get away from that place. Our oldest son, Daryl Kenyatta, reached a point where he refused to eat. He would not study. He would not talk. My daughter would go to bed with her dad's picture, holding it every night. The youngest one, Van, who was 3, would go to bed with this little rifle. I knew we could no longer live in that house. A woman who was lonely and afraid, but one who was determined to make it. Everything I did was based on what I thought Medgar would have wanted and the promises that I made to him the night before he was killed. My grandmother said to me, you run as far away from Mississippi as you can get without going into the ocean. California became home, and until this day, it still is. Now, people ask me, what is the connecting thread among these women? And it's so hard because each is unique and they're fascinating and they're such full, complete human beings. But I've reduced it to 3 major characteristics: authenticity, courage, and purpose. That's what they had, that's what they projected, and that's what they did to move the civil rights movement forward and to move this country forward.